Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society. Hi, I'm your host, Dawn Kernagis, and joining me is Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the Double Secret Selection Committee that selects all the guests to appear on STEM Talk.
Hello, Don. Great to be here with you today to discuss our chat with a man who is very well known in the wellness, performance, and paleo community, none other than Robb Wolf.
Yeah, I've heard Robb's name for years in the context of the Paleo Diet and also through his own podcast, The Paleo Solution. It was actually great getting the chance to talk with him more about nutrition and other approaches to overall wellness, and also having him as a guest on STEM Talk, as he has had both of us on his podcast.
Yes, indeed. Robb is a super guy in many regards.
Yeah, I enjoyed many of my evolutionary biology courses as an undergrad, so it was really cool to talk to him about an evolutionary approach to medicine, both at the preventative and also the therapeutic level. We had a lot of fun talking with Robb.
Absolutely. Great guy.
Yeah. Before we get to today's interview, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who subscribe to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews that are piling up on iTunes.
As we announced in several earlier episodes, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continuously and carefully reviewing the iTunes reviews with an eye toward selecting the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled, and that's really important, reviews for us to read here on STEM Talk. As always, if you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.eus to claim your official STEM Talk shirt.
Yeah, our STEM Talk shirts are just flying off the shelf.
Poof. Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the wonderful nickname Leafy Sweets, entitled No Bro Science Here.
And Leafy Sweets said, science-based interviews with experts, postdocs, and department/lab heads on relevant topics. No bro science here, but still interesting discussions relevant to one's well-being and interests. Thank you, Leafy Sweets. As a vegetarian, I think this is one of my favorite nicknames, actually. And all the other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk get off to such a great start.
Okay, now on to today's interview with Robb Wolf.
Robb Wolf, a former research biochemist, is the New York Times bestselling author of The Paleo Solution, The Original Human Diet. In addition to his book, Robb has reached hundreds of thousands of people around the world via his top-ranked iTunes podcast, The Paleo Solution.
Robb has been a review editor for the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism, is co-founder of the nutrition and athletic training journal, The Performance Menu, is co-owner of NorCal Strength and Conditioning, which, by the way, is one of Men's Health's top 30 gyms in America. And he is also a consultant for the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency program.
He also serves on the board of directors for Specialty Health Incorporated, Paleo FX, Paleo Magazine, and the Savory Institute.
Robb has provided seminars in nutrition and strength and conditioning to many entities, and we'll just name a few here, but they include NASA, Naval Special Warfare, the Canadian Light Infantry, and the United States Marine Corps.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Hi, this is Dawn Kernagis, and today I'd like to welcome to our podcast Robb Wolf. Robb, welcome to the podcast.
Huge honor to be here. Thank you.
Welcome, Robb.
I was going to say, and with us is Dr. Ken Ford, and Ken, welcome to the podcast as well.
Thanks, Dawn.
Yeah. So, Robb, let's start at the beginning. Tell us about your upbringing. Did anything about it specifically inspire you to become interested in health and fitness?
Oh, wow. Yeah, for sure. You know, looking back, I was raised by two well-meaning but quite ill parents, and both of them smoked. Neither of them exercised. Both of them developed type 2 diabetes pretty early in their lives. And I'm not really sure why, but somewhere along the line, I suspected that if I ate better and maybe exercised, that I could, maybe have a better outcome than what they were experiencing. But they had both kind of given up all, thought that they could change the direction of their lives with some better nutrition or exercise. They were really out of that kind of post-World War II if my doctor tells me to do it, I'm good to go. There's going to be magic in a pill at some point, so I won't need to modify my diet or exercise. And they really just kind of acquiesced all their health to the medical establishment. And I went just as opposite that vector as you could possibly imagine. So it was, I think a lot of people who were raised in an environment like that, like they either kind of join that party or they run screaming the opposite direction. And I was the scream the opposite direction.
Yeah, well, good. So tell us about your education and about your early career as a biochemist.
I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I had a pretty good interest in science in general. But I was really floundering around. Like my undergrad was quite a protracted experience, and I finally
I was there with you. I did the same thing.
Yeah. And I got into an organic chemistry class and loved it. Loved it like I had never loved anything before, and actually discovered that I had a pretty good aptitude for kind of spinning molecules in my head and thinking about bond angles and stuff like that. And as an undergrad, I got a research fellowship where I was able to spend a whole summer working on a prochiral ketone, trying to use specific reducing agents to get some chirality out of these ketone starting products. And this was part of a proposed new antibiotic. And so I had 4 fume hoods and all the reagents I could handle. And I would set this stuff up in the morning and then go play Frisbee and lift weights and then come back and work it up and set up another run. And I slept in the chemistry club, lounge and basically lived in the university for a whole summer. And that was honestly like possibly the best summer I've ever had in my life. And I just absolutely loved it. But I wrapped up an undergrad at California State University-Chico in biochemistry, really thought about medical school. But as I kind of progressed along, I actually had some pretty serious health problems at this time. And in unraveling these health problems, this idea of kind of an evolutionary and medicine approach to health and wellness got on my radar. And when I looked at that, it really made 8 years of studying disease process and pathology via med school and paperwork and litigation just looked incredibly unappealing. And then I'm also kind of a cranky, cantankerous person, and academia seemed to move at glacial speeds. So academia really wasn't that exciting for me either. And it was around 2001, 2002 that I found this kind of weird thing called CrossFit on the interwebs. And I decided to peel out of academia. I was doing kind of bench research on lipid metabolism. And I opened a gym, and it happened to be the first CrossFit affiliate gym in the world. And then I opened a second one, and that was the 4th CrossFit affiliate gym in the world. And it was kind of interesting because from my perspective, that was kind of the medicine that I wanted to practice. I got to talk to people about sleep, food, exercise, build community, train them in a way that seemed to be kind of synergistic with their genetics and really have kind of a fun, challenging environment. And that was kind of the launching pad for everything else that I did. I learned an enormous amount in that kind of clinical interface, working with all kinds of different people, different disease conditions, different health status. We managed to develop some great relationships with healthcare providers in our area so that we started getting some synergistic work with those folks. And that was really incredibly rewarding work for me because I could kind of keep a little bit of a research hat just by, finding topics that I was interested in. I was still part of a research group, so I would get email updates about what was going on in different areas. But then also I had this gym that I was working in, and it was really a cool balance between the two worlds.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you've kind of talked about what launched you from biochemistry to health and fitness, but you talked about the fact that you were introduced to this concept of evolutionary medicine. What introduced you to that in the first place?
Oh, it's kind of a convoluted story, but again, I was pretty sick as wrapping up my undergrad. I was actually vegan at the time, which I ascribed a lot of problems with this high carb, low-fat vegan diet. But in looking back, the dietary issues were a factor, but I was not sleeping. I had moved to Seattle. I lived in a basement apartment where the ceiling was maybe 6 inches above my head. I hadn't seen the sun in like 9 months, and so my circadian rhythm was crushed. So initially, I really ascribed a lot of the problems to just the vegan diet, but there was a reality that I was just living so far afield from what my genetics were wired for that was a big problem. But I had a lot of GI problems, and my mother had had a number of health problems for years, and she actually had some sort of a autoimmune flare that put her in the hospital, and her rheumatologist ran some tests on her, and he determined that she was reactive to grains, legumes, and dairy. And this was just kind of the story that she related to me on the phone. I was talking to her, and I was like, grains, legumes, and dairy? Well, what on earth do you eat if you don't eat that, And I started noodling on it, and it was really just kind of almost this flow of consciousness thing. But I was like, okay, grains, legumes, and dairy, that's like agriculture. What do you eat before agriculture? And I had heard of this term, a Paleolithic diet, caveman-type diet. And this was around 1998, and so it kind of popped into my head, paleo diet. Like that's what you hunted and gathered before grains, legumes, and dairy. So I went into the house and turned on my computer and waited for the dial-up to kind of boot up, and there was this new thing called Google. And in Google, I put this term Paleolithic diet, and I found some work by an economist, Arthur Devaney, and also another researcher, Lauren Cordain, who Lauren ended up being kind of my mentor in studying a lot of this material. But there wasn't a lot out there at that time. But what was written at that point, Lauren had written a paper, Cereal Grains, Mankind's Double-Edged Sword. And it really went deep on the anti-nutrients in grains and some of the kind of immunogenic potential that were found in grains and legumes, and it really connected a lot of dots for me. And so that was really where this idea of a paleo or ancestral type diet, as well as the other lifestyle features like circadian rhythm and sleep and whatnot. But that's where all of that kind of got on my radar. And that's the way that I've informed everything that I've done since then.
And that had to be kind of a wake-up. So thinking about things through the lens of evolutionary biology, can you talk about the collision of how we humans are wired to eat and what we can actually find on the shelves of local supermarkets? If we walk in and just start going shopping, there seems to be a bit of a collision there.
Yeah, we're set up for failure.
Yeah.
I half-jokingly say that if you live in this modern environment and you're not fat, sick, diabetic, and broken, that you're kind of screwing up. Like you're not really paying homage to your evolutionary history, because we are somewhat wired to eat everything that's not nailed down and then go lay down and rest and conserve as much energy as possible. And now we live in an environment in which we effectively have limitless caloric or energetic inputs. We don't really need to expend any effort to obtain these items. And then we have literally a limitless palate options. So even within the normal environment, if we found something pretty tasty, there's a process called palate fatigue where we will get bored of a particular flavor. But in our modern world, if you get tired of Twinkies, then there's nachos. And once you're tired of nachos, then there's chili cheese nachos, and you can keep tweaking these palate experiences in a way that we can really bypass the neuroregulation of appetite and dramatically overconsume calories in general, and then low quality calories, insulinogenic and immunogenic foods, very low nutrient density. So the cards are stacked against us in a variety of ways, and it's going to be a really interesting challenge to unravel that whole story.
Great. What is your current understanding of what it is to consume a paleo diet? Where are the you hear about the Mediterranean diet, right? Well, what is that? Is that pasta? Is that fish?
Well, I mean, when you really live in the Mediterranean, it doesn't look anything like what is usually consumed here or recommended in the studies. My wife's Italian, and we spend a fair amount of time in Mediterranean-type countries, and it's kind of laughable the way that it gets interpreted. But, this paleo diet concept, it's really unfortunate in some ways that the term was paleo diet and instead of like an evolutionary diet or an ancestral diet. Yeah. But this is an artifact just of anthropologists and archaeologists working with what they found in archaeological remains and then also contemporary living hunter-gatherers, and they noticed that there was kind of a tendency for them to eat very little in the way of processed foods, tended to be little in the way of grains, legumes, and dairy. And so by exclusion, that's kind of the easiest way to describe what a paleo diet is. You're generally not eating much in the way of grains, legumes, and dairy, and so it's kind of you're eating everything else: meat, fruits, roots, shoots, vegetables. But it's a really it's an ongoing problem for me because on the one hand, to help the masses, we need some simple heuristics, some simple stories to try to help people affect some dietary changes. Like I've worked with folks that really didn't fully grasp that like fruits and vegetables grew in the dirt. Like this was literally kind of like, really? Like dirt? It grows in the dirt? Like they're so disconnected from our food supply that it was really an odd concept for them. So you have folks like that are just trying to figure out some really basic elements of nutrition and lifestyle so that they can get out of type 2 diabetes or some really serious health problems. And then on the other side, you have a quite educated group of folks who cruise around the interwebs and dig around on PubMed, and they may be as well educated on a topic like this as most top-level researchers. And so they will get really cranky about, well, why are you excluding green beans because it's a legume, And you have these it seems like the prohibitions out of religious texts against petting dogs or eating shellfish. It just seems kind of ridiculous, and in a lot of ways it is. Paleo kind of turned into a thing where people spend a lot of time asking, is this paleo or not, instead of asking, is this a good item for me? And the question with that relates to nutrient density and maybe carbohydrate load and then potential immunogenic properties, like could we end up with some gut irritation from this food? So the paleo diet concept is really interesting. I think it's incredibly valuable if you're able to couch it within this evolutionary biology term, but it was really unfortunate that the term was paleo diet that was picked way back when in the anthropological literature to describe this whole thing.
That's a good answer. So in your current best thinking, you continue to exclude those food items you named?
In general, but I'm not religious about it. And I kind of I've been low carb for quite some time, maybe 100, 150 grams of carbohydrate a day, although I've really enjoyed ketogenic diets in the past. It's where I get my best cognition from. And I'm playing again with a ketogenic diet because I've been getting leaned on by folks like you and some other people to get in and see if I can fuel my Brazilian jiu-jitsu activity with a more keto-driven diet. But, I found that things like lentils and some beans and occasionally some corn, like I really didn't have problems with those if I kept the dose moderate and particularly post-workout, like I seem to do fine with those. Whereas I am highly reactive to gluten and gluten-like grains. If I get a dose of that, then you don't want me near your personal restroom after that because you'll need a priest and an exorcism to undo what I will end up doing to that facility. So, yeah.
That's worrisome.
Yeah, it is. It is, yeah.
What role do you think genetics play in all this? Given the variability in our ancestral heritage, do you think that different individuals will respond best to different versions of an ancestral diet?
I think it would be crazy to assume that there's not significant variation within this story. And then complexifying that picture a bit, what role does the gut microbiome and the microbiome in general play in modifying those genetics? And there's some pretty good research. There's a group, the Weitzman group in Israel, did a study where they took about 800 people, did a subcutaneous continuous blood glucose monitor, tracked the gut microbiome, did some basic blood work on these folks, and then they started feeding them a battery of meals, just totally random meals, and tracking what the glycemic response was for these folks. And it was all over the map. But what they were able to do is take some machine learning algorithms and apply it to the data that they pulled out. And they were able to start getting some possible predictive algorithms. and they were able to take another group of people, do the same analysis on those folks, and then based off of their gut microbiome, genetics, and blood markers, they were able to actually predict a battery of different foods and meals that they suspected would work well for them. And then when they tested that seemed to bear things out. But it was really interesting. Like they had some folks, one person would eat a banana and had virtually no blood glucose response to it. Different person would eat a banana and they would get into nearly diabetic ranges with the banana. And then another person would eat a cookie and have the same thing, like no blood glucose response to a cookie. They metabolize it fine. Then another person nearly a diabetic level of blood glucose response. So it's clear in my mind that there's massive variation for folks and that a one-size-fits-all approach is really, really problematic. But again, it really begs the question, how do you affect kind of like public health policy? How do you help large numbers of people? And I still think recommending largely unprocessed whole foods is a good place to start with that. But over the course of time, I think we're going to discover that there's an enormous amount of nuance there and not really a ton of things that we can hang our hats on.
You know, it would be surprising to me if Northern Europeans and Catawans would both be ideally suited to eat exactly the same diet.
Right.
Particularly for genetic reasons, but also for, as you mentioned, gut microbiome reasons. You know, one finds typically a very different microbiome in those two populations.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, so Robb, you've talked about the ancestral phenotypic norm, which is obviously not the phenotypic norm of the standard population today. In addition to different diet, our ancestors were significantly more active just by necessity, as you're talking about. They're either active or then they're resting and kind of resting up for the next activity. So when it comes to highly active populations, so kind of the outside from the norm of today's society, has anybody looked at the impact of a paleo type diet versus a standard Western diet in those populations, like hard laborers or even professional athletes?
Not to my knowledge. That's a really great question. It's mainly been studied in disease populations, folks with existing cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, or insulin resistance. Some situations, Linda Forsetto looked at folks that have, say, like stage 1 or stage 2 renal disease, but I haven't really seen much specifically looking at like a performance-enhancing potentiality for a paleo-type diet in a hard-charging group of folks. There is a really contentious it's interesting. The NSCA and some other folks backed a study looking at CrossFit and a paleo-type diet, but those folks appear to be getting sued, or there's some sort of legal thing, but it's a judge ruled that it was pretty clear that the study folks cooked a bunch of the data to portray both CrossFit and the paleo diet in kind of a negative light, and so that's kind of the high watermark that we have for that topic, unfortunately. But you know, this is very anecdotal, but it's interesting sometimes if you get in and do a little bit of Google Trends searching. And so if you do some things like best MMA diet, best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu diet, best triathlon diet, you see a lot of chatter around kind of gluten-free paleo-type diets being very, very popular among people experimenting with that. And again, it's totally observational, where there's no real data there, but I would make an argument that both coaches and elite performers tend to be quite ahead of academia in just empirically figuring out what works well. I do a lot of work with the special operations community, and those people really are in a constant competition among their peer groups to figure out what can I do that will improve performance. And those folks more often than not eat something that looks quite a bit like a paleo type diet. Now they're not perfect on it. It's a non-religious deal. When they get deployed, they certainly eat MREs. But where previously they just had MREs, now they're taking jerky and nuts and better quality food with them to kind of round out the offerings that they have. But when they have control over their eating, when they're in a non-deployed scenario, they tend to eat much better than what they did previously.
Yeah. And like you said, anecdotally, you hear stories of them just saying, I just feel better. I feel, you know, so.
Yeah. And when you get into that hard charger crowd, it's always, some people are going to be elite no matter what they do. So you have to have take a grain of salt with it. But then also sometimes the folks that are really elite are digging into the stuff that's really working. So, I think keeping a little healthy skepticism with it, but also thinking, well, maybe these guys might be onto something. And I always joke to some degree that, in college, most of us had some sort of horrific diet of pizza and beer, and we did it for months on end, and it didn't kill us. And so my greasy used car salesman pitch around this stuff is, why don't you give it a shot for a month, see how you look, feel, and perform, do blood work before and afterwards, and see if it works. See if the net results are worthwhile. And even if you receive results, there's also the argument to be made: is it worth doing it? Like, does it so dramatically impact your quality of life that this is no longer worthwhile given the relative degree of, performance enhancement that you may have? So I think those are all really honest, reasonable questions and kind of evaluations that somebody can apply to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought it was interesting. You talked about working with gene expression microarray. So I actually did work with that as well. I was laughing. You said it's pretty boring. I was like, yeah, it is.
Yes.
So it's a lot more time in front of the computer than anything else. But
right.
But I thought that the point that you made about looking at gene expression, kind of global gene expression, when you're looking at physical inactivity versus activity, is night and day when you're looking at the transcriptomic kind of phenotype, if you want to call it that.
Right.
So do you think diet alone can impact that or shift it back into kind of like a healthier phenotype? If you're looking at like a sedentary individual and you're just looking at diet alone, do you think diet alone, like a healthier diet, a cleaner diet, can help shift some of that back towards like a cleaner, happier, healthier phenotype that you would see in someone who's an active individual?
I definitely think so, but I mean, it's really interesting because when we look at the data on exercise, it kind of looks like it makes us live a little longer, but maybe not that much. And there's lots of people that don't really do much in the way of exercise, and they can live a quite long, reasonably healthy life. But I still think that there's something that's missing there, and it sounds almost quasi-mystical, like it's really hard to pin that stuff down. But I really do think for kind of the optimum human experience, we need some sort of vigorous physical activity, at least occasionally. But clearly, if we had sedentary individual plus poor diet, I think that's going to be really bad. Let's say sedentary individual, poor diet, terrible sleep patterns. Like, that's just a disaster. And so any one of those factors that we could kind of reel back and get into better kind of parameters relative to what would be ideal, I think we're going to see improvements in general health, but, as an extension of kind of the transcription, byproducts. If we eat better, I think that we're going to see improvements. Going out on a limb, I might argue that a ketogenic diet or some sort of a lower carb diet plus some fasting can actually mimic a lot of the physiological processes that we see with exercise. But I'm not sure how much mileage we can get out of that. Like, I would still like to maintain muscle mass and maintain the large motor units in muscle. And there's some indication that a ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting can enhance certain elements of our metabolism, like mitochondrial density. It might have some pro-apoptotic and autophagy kind of benefits. But I still think that for the optimum, we want some exercise and a variety of exercise, some resistance training, some low-level physical activity, some white buffalo in the sky, metabolic conditioning occasionally, and then some intermittency in our diet. Both we need some periods of relative abundance, and we also need some scarcity. And I think that is then sending the signaling that is possibly most consistent with both health and longevity. We've historically looked at all of this story as just kind of a bomb calorimeter, energy in, energy out. And I think that we really understand much better now that these are all signaling molecules, all the nutrients coming in, all of the metabolic byproducts that are a consequence of consuming these foods, the metabolic byproducts of exercise itself. These are all signaling molecules, and they're I think that it's almost in kind of an orchestral type of story. There's an expectation for a certain type of cadence and beat to our physical activity and our nutrient intake. And if we get out of step with that, then I'm not sure. Then I think that we're predisposing ourselves to a transcriptome that may be pathogenic at some point.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
So when I was in grad school, it was really interesting because I had a lot of friends who were getting into CrossFit, and some of them were even CrossFit coaches. They were former athletes trying to find a way to kind of tap back into that healthier lifestyle. And so with that, they would go into the Paleo Diet.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I first heard about this. Is probably almost 10 years ago now, which is kind of scary. But it was funny because, and I'm sure you've sat in plenty of these debates and conversations where we would go out to dinner with friends who are not doing the paleo or not on any specific diet. They were on the grad student diet like you were talking about. And so they would get into this argument about evolution and say, okay, well, legumes and grains and dairy, we've had enough time as humans and exposure to them that we've evolved to be able to process the intake of those things. But their argument was, well, just what you're saying is that all you're doing is eating cleaner, healthier, unprocessed food. So my question is, have any studies been done looking at kind of just like unprocessed, clean, whole food versus like a strict paleo type diet as far as health status goes?
They've done several studies comparing, say like a Mediterranean type diet, but I think even before we started recording, like the whole concept of what is a Mediterranean type diet, it very poorly fleshed out. Interesting study by Linda Forsetto, and hopefully I'll remember all the details, but they created an isocaloric scenario. So they had folks eating a mixed diet, kind of Mediterranean in nature, and a paleo-type diet, meat, roots, shoots, vegetables, nuts, seeds, seafood. They had two groups of folks, and they monitored them for their resting metabolic rate and physical activity and fed them at a level so that they would not lose body weight. One part of this story is that the paleo diet group, the food was so satiating, it was a monster to get these people to eat enough food not to lose weight. But it wasn't metabolic ward, but it was just kind of a step down from that. Like it was very tightly controlled. So they made these folks eat enough such that they didn't lose weight. It was very difficult to get the paleo diet group to eat enough food such that they did not lose weight. But absent weight loss, they saw dramatically improved blood lipids and systemic inflammatory markers in the paleo diet group. And this is in an isocaloric setting. And it was a really fantastic study because oftentimes people will dismiss improvements in metabolic parameters because there was weight loss. And oftentimes they will decry this in higher protein diets. But, really the trick in a free living group of folks trying to affect change, they need to be able to do this on their own. They can't live in a metabolic ward setting. So when people dismiss the inherent satiety benefits of something like a paleo diet or a ketogenic diet, it's really kind of crazy from a clinical-based, implementation story. I know that we want to be as tight as we can on our thermodynamic analysis of what's going on so that we're not dealing in fantasy. But really the name of the game is trying to get free living populations to spontaneously reduce caloric intake. And it seems like something like a paleo-type diet both is highly satiating, so it's relatively easy to affect this spontaneous reduction in calories. But even in this scenario in which they were fed to a level that they would not lose weight, then it was found that their blood lipids improved and markers of systemic inflammation improved. And that's probably the closest that I could think of, and that was Linda Frassetto at UCSF.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'll have to
Yeah, it's a
look that
fascinating study.
Yeah. So this is where I admit that I'm a vegetarian, and I've actually been vegetarian for 22 years. It's a personal choice. It's not, I don't care what anybody else eats. So essentially I grew up on my grandparents' farm during the summer, and we would help raise the animals. And I always had this hard time, even before I stopped eating meat, just differentiating between something that I raised and then something that I would kill to eat. It was a personal, kind of almost an emotional choice. So when I was 17, my grandfather told me who I was eating at the dinner table. I don't remember the chicken's name. It was like Cluck or something like that. So I called it quits. I was like, I'm done. I'm out. Like I said, I've never cared about what anybody else eats. And I really have no patience for people who scream at each other for what someone else is eating. I don't like people yelling at me for being vegetarian. And I know we've had this conversation. It's just, what I eat, that's my choice. However, I know there are other people that are out there who are vegetarian for the same reasons or vegetarian for religious reasons. So it's kind of like you're not budging us to eating meat. But I know that a lot of us are interested in something like the paleo diet. So do you have any recommendations for a vegetarian interested in a paleo type diet?
Yeah, so I mean, within the vegetarian term, there's a huge amount of latitude. Like some people think fish is okay. Other people find eggs and dairy okay. And I forget who it was. I was listening to a great podcast, but he made the point that it's still essentially omnivory if you're doing, eggs and dairy and stuff like that. So really there's only one vegetarian diet, which is a vegan diet, which I think gets orders of magnitude more complex to deal with. But if we're doing eggs and dairy, it really is pretty easy to make that work. I still think that we look at the individual and ask what type of insulin sensitivity do we have going on with this individual? Do we have any signs or symptoms of metabolic derangement, dyslipidemia, increased blood pressure, any type of energy swings? And if we do see that, then we want to steer things towards kind of a lower glycemic load approach. I think properly prepared legumes, particularly lentils, black beans, kidney beans, garbanzo beans are a great kind of background primary energy source that folks could use. And then lots of coconut oil, nut butters, and then, the cheese and eggs and all that stuff kind of rounding it out. But we would just kind of steer things towards a lower glycemic load type of diet as best we could within those parameters. I would still, unless the person is really, really talented in their genetics in handling carbohydrate, like a bowl of white rice is just problematic to me for a lot of people. There's not a lot of nutrition there. There's a whole lot of glycemic load. So steering things more towards whole unprocessed legumes and nut butters, protein powders, and then the cheese and dairy, eggs as tolerated. The one caveat I would have with that is that we do end up in a fairly monochromatic dietary pattern. And so, like if you're relying on eggs frequently for your protein source, I would recommend rotating those out pretty frequently so that we minimize the likelihood of some sort of a food sensitivity, because it would really stink if you're already in a little bit of a constrained aperture and then all of a sudden eggs kind of go out the window. I ate eggs far too frequently. And about 3 years ago, I noticed that I really just didn't feel particularly good after eating eggs. And when I pulled them out of the rotation, I felt better. It was kind of like some blood sugar regulation type stuff and a little bit of GI irritation. And I feel way better without them. But man, it just limits your options even further. And had I just been better about rotating eggs in and out, I don't think that I would have developed that problem.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, really just taking those vegetarian options that you have, trying to have as much variety as possible, and really steering things towards an appropriate glycemic load for the individual. And that's really all you need to do to make that work. And then the same stories that we play with regardless of food. Try to sleep in accordance with the circadian rhythm. Try to go to bed earlier, wake up earlier. There seems to be a little indication that maybe front-loading some of the calories earlier in the day as opposed to later in the day may have some metabolic benefits. So we can look at that. putting more carbohydrate in the post-workout, post-exercise period can mitigate some of the insulin response. So just using the same tricks that we would use regardless of dietary practice. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll have to look into this a little bit more. So tell us about what you eat these days. And I know you've talked about the fact that your wife is Italian. So does she participate with you on the paleo diet? And also your little girls, do they eat paleo?
Yeah. So I do about 99% of the cooking. So what Papa Wolf cooks, the rest of the wolf pack pretty much eats. My wife, when I met her, was actually vegan at the time. Okay. And I was quite good at cooking vegan food. And I never said a word to her about anything. I was like, this is what I'm doing. This is what you're going to do. But I would prep these meals, and because when you look at my wife and you look at me, you're kind of like, I don't see how this works. But it's the fact I was really, really good at cooking is the only reason why she married me, because you're like, I don't see how these two things match up here. But but I really did a fantastic job cooking for her, because I was hoping to kind of reel her in over the long haul.
Good job.
Thank you. Yeah. And but when she looked at the two meals that were prepped, like hers was, it was like some tofu and some beans and stuff and some veggies, but it was a lot of brown food. Yeah. And then she looked at the stuff that I had, and I had like a curry with a bunch of, like a mountain of vegetables and all this kind of color and texture and everything. And she was like, man, your food looks a hell of a lot better than mine. And she started kind of eating it. And so she just kind of transitioned over. And her dad had a little bit of health problems. And he started sniffing around this stuff, switched his diet, lost like 25 pounds. And he's 66 now and can work me under the table. Like, he can just work me to death. And he's been eating this way about 12 years. And we're not religious about it. Like once a week we'll do kind of gluten-free pizza night. So like the one thing that we're pretty fastidious about with the girls and just in the house in general, we really don't eat much in the way of gluten. Yeah. And I'm super reactive to it. Some people get really spun out about this idea that this is all just a fad, but I've spent 20 years researching this from kind of an immunological perspective, and there's just a lot of folks that really benefit from gluten removal. Mm-hmm. And there's some solid mechanism with that. And again, the 30-day removal reintroduction is just amazingly educational on that topic. So we generally feed the girls gluten-free, but they get some beans, a little bit of rice, a little bit of corn tortillas. But the preponderance is sweet potatoes, fruit, fish, seafood. Both girls eat homemade sauerkraut. Both girls eat homemade kimchi. They'll eat liver. They eat just about everything. And it's really interesting. We just took the girls to the dentist not long ago, and they were really just like, there was some hemming and hawing, and the dentist, I'm like, what's going on back there? And he said, it's really interesting. Your girls have a lot of space between their teeth. And I was like, well, that's good, right? That means that they're not going to have crowding. And he said, yeah, they have the broadest jaws and the most space of any kid that I've seen in like 10 years. And, because you think about things like wisdom teeth and dentistry in the Paleolithic, not so good, And so people make these cases that we're now adapted to eat these foods. We're really not. We've still had to figure out workarounds via technology, like the lower nutrient density foods that we have a tendency to eat end up causing a shortening of our dental arch, crowding of teeth, and that would kill us were it not for modern dentistry. And so we've been able to figure out a workaround with that, but I wouldn't necessarily call that an evolved state. Whereas our kids who've had bone broth and high amounts of vitamins A, D, and K, throughout from breastfeeding from mom all the way through to the foods that we've given them, they've already, we're seeing kind of phenotypic expression that is quite different than virtually all the other kids that this dentist sees. Yeah. And he's a child dentist, and it was noteworthy enough that he and all the nurses were kind of like, well, gee whiz, look at this, so, that's the way that we generally feed the kids. We're not religious about it. If I had kids 10 years ago, I would have probably made a mess of the situation because I would have been much more of a zealot around the topic. We have noticed some interesting stuff, though. there are certain thresholds of hyperpalatability in foods that are fascinating to see. So we'll give the girls a little bit of 90% dark chocolate, and they'll eat it, and they're fine. They'll have a piece, and they're done. But we give them an 80% dark chocolate piece, which is remarkably sweeter, when you eat it, and it almost reaches a need to throw them in the room and lock the door because I want more. And there are certain foods that there are these gluten-free snickerdoodles that my wife makes around the holidays that are kind of almond flour and some vanilla and cinnamon, and they are ridiculous. They're so amazing. And you give one of the girls one of those cookies, and they will cry and melt down and beg to have another one. Whereas a bowl of fruit with some whipped cream on it, some 90% dark chocolate, they will eat it, but then there is an off switch. But you can hit certain points where the food is so palatable, so amazing, that the girls will throw a fit, and for 4 or 5 days afterwards, hey, Dad, do we have any of those snickerdoodles around? It's fascinating to me, and I think that it should be really instructive for us to understand that these hyperpalatable foods are influencing everyone in the same way, and we have to find some sort of a workable level within that so that we can have some variety, have some fun, kick our heels up and have fun, but also not end up in the losing position. Yeah.
Well, certainly the neural regulation of appetite is just an area of huge interest for you.
Absolutely.
And I wondered if you might say a little more about that.
Well, it's a huge topic. I would defer to Stefan Guillenet, who's really a world expert on this stuff. But my take on the neuroregulation of appetite, for the last 50 or 60 years, we've had these macronutrient wars. Is it high carb? Is it low carb? And I think that that's really been missing the point so much. And it's so fascinating when you go back through and unravel all this story. You have some folks that say it's just calories, and you have other folks that say it's not really about the calories. Protein is different than fat, is different than carbohydrates. And really both of these worldviews have elements of truth to them, but really at the end of the day, what we do want to see for improved health is some ability for people to eat an appropriate amount for their physical activity and energetic needs, and not much more, not much less, not much more. And that really boils down to the neuroregulation of appetite. And there are certain things like dense protein sources, highly fibrous carbohydrate sources that tend to be really highly satiating. But interestingly also, the state of ketosis is incredibly satiating and seems to be disproportionately so relative to the relative caloric intake. And I guess one takeaway that I would love for folks to noodle on is within medicine and dietetics, there is only one disordered eating that they acknowledge, and that is trying to limit palate options in some way. If you show up with, and you're eating a big gulp and some Twinkies, you're good to go. But whether you are vegan or whether you're paleo or something else like that, if you're trying to limit palate options in some way, food options in some way, then the current dietetics model considers you to be a disordered eater. They call it orthorexia. But in every study that's ever been done comparing kind of an American dietetics recommended diet with a vegan diet, a high-protein diet, et cetera, the diet that fails consistently is the diet that is the moderate, don't exclude any food groups diet. And
have you ever noticed the dietitian's typical phenotype?
Yes.
Okay.
Not dissimilar from the aerobics instructor phenotype. Yeah. So, and it's just fascinating. And I don't know, the cynic in me says that this is a job security move. If we sell the American populace and really the world, and it's just a crying shame that Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all these other people, none of these people like our political policies. They don't like any of our gun laws. They don't like our healthcare system. But yet they really adopt our medical and nutrition practices, lock, stock, and smoking barrel. And it's just maddening to me.
Well, there's something wonderful about that in some cases.
There is. There's some irony there. But, the the one thing that you must, in my opinion, in this modern hyperpalatable environment, if you want to succeed, you have to limit palate options to some degree. You just have to. And I don't care if you want to be vegan, then be vegan. If you want to go low carb, high fat, then do that. But the thing that will get you in the deep end of the pool that will create challenges is if you have a nearly infinite palate variety before you. Nobody will self-regulate very effectively in that story.
Coming back to ketosis, we've mentioned a few times already today. You mentioned that you've had experience with it. As you know, I spend most of my time in ketosis. How did you feel? I mean, some people report feeling, going through this initial adaptation period where they feel quite off. Mm-hmm. I didn't actually have that, but post your adaptation period, how did you feel? Was it in terms of cognition and that kind of thing?
So I had been sick, I think, my whole young adult and adult life, and I think some insulin resistance. It really kind of felt like my head was stuffed with cotton and the whole world was happening like a meter outside of me. It was almost like a time delay to get to me. And despite all, I just thought that was normal. I thought everybody operated that way. And my first foray into kind of ancestral eating was actually a low-carb ketogenic diet. And when I clicked into ketosis, it was prior to that moment, I had minutes here and there of like some mental clarity and balanced blood sugar. Prior to that, when I was eating my current meal, I was planning the next meal because I knew that there was a hypoglycemic event just waiting around the corner. And if I got into that hypoglycemic event, it was bad, like really, really uncomfortable. And so I had minutes here and there where I felt good, had mental clarity. And then when I first clicked into ketosis, and this was around 1998, it was just amazing. Like I had incredible mental clarity, focus. I could go hours or even days without eating, and it just didn't faze me at all. And this was miraculous for me. At the time, I was mainly doing gymnastics type activity and a little bit of Brazilian martial arts called capoeira, which is very similar to gymnastics. So not a lot of glycolytic load. And then I got into CrossFit and was trying to keto fuel the CrossFit activity. And this was ages ago, and so I really wasn't aware of the need for really good attention to electrolytes and a pretty high sodium intake. And there were a lot of details there that I wasn't aware of at the time that I think could have improved that situation. But that's where I started kind of playing with a modicum of carbohydrate intake. And so I was in pretty deep ketosis for about 6 or 7 years. And then I've spent maybe the last five odd years in this low carb state, 100, 150 grams of carbs, mainly post-workout. And that's worked pretty well, but I still am in a little bit of that carbohydrate conveyor belt. Like I don't have that ability that if there was just no food around, that I could go for 3 days and be cognitively and physically essentially unfazed by this lack of food. And that's always been kind of annoying. But at the same time, I just get the absolute tar beat out of me at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I haven't wanted to remove the little bit of a low gear that I have with that, but I've been hanging out with some of the guys from the Keto Gains group, and then I've talked to you, and I'm going to really get in and fiddle with my electrolytes, try doing some pre-workout electrolyte bolusing, as well as some collagen supplementation. Seems to be some indication of some beneficial signaling there. So I'm going to get in and keto adapt and play with that.
Maybe some essential amino acids.
Right. Yeah.
Even intra-workout. I think you'd really like that.
Right. Yeah, I know Peter Attia has talked at length about wanting to get that the right kind of IGF signaling around the workout period and try to really target that. So using the branched chain amino acids in the intra-workout period so we get that IGF activity in the muscles, trying to deal with our mTOR situation and maintain muscle mass as best we can during that whole story.
Right.
But yeah, I feel amazing while in a ketotic state. So I'm really hoping that I can crack the code on this and make my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu work.
I think you'll do it.
Yeah.
It was important to me when I realized when in ketosis that my electrolytes were too low.
Right.
Hey, Robb, have you had a chance to tinker with some of the exogenous ketones?
I have a little bit, yeah, and I think they're reasonably impressive. The ketone salts consistently give me some pretty nasty GI upset, and so I've found the cost-benefit story there to not really be worth it. Like, I'm out on the jiu-jitsu mat and somebody's trying to choke me, and then I have to dash off the mat and spend 5 minutes in the locker room. That's not really a net win.
It's a good story, though.
It's a good story, yeah.
You wouldn't have submitted me.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'm just getting ready to play with some of the ketone esters, and so I'll be playing with that more. But, honestly, I've just used MCT oil pre-workout or when I need a little bit of a ketone boost, and that'll pop me up 0.5, maybe even 1 millimolar with a decent bolus of that. And something I've done to minimize the GI distress with that is I will mix about equal parts MCT oil with soy lecithin, which is a fantastic emulsifier, and then I'll maybe put a little bit of extra nut butter with that as a bit of a carrier. And I find that I can get 2 or 3 tablespoons at a time of MCT oil and have no GI problems. Whereas if I just did the MCT oil kind of bare or naked, like that would be
rough.
That would be 6 or 7 hours of I need some great reading material in the washroom. Yeah.
I haven't tried the nut butter, but the lecithin I do actually.
Right.
The little lecithin, like little nodules.
Yeah.
And
that's just mix them all together.
That's actually really good stuff. And I think you're going to find the esters both more palatable and much more efficacious than the salts. I have the same results with the salts. I do just as well with MCT oil practically as the salts.
Right.
In fact, probably I like to blend the two if I use the salts at all.
Right.
Whereas the esters will pop you up 3 or 4 millimolars minimum. And that's a big jump.
Right.
And I think the GI effects are less.
Yeah, everything that I've read on that seems to be the case, but I literally just about 10 days ago received one sample from one company and another sample from another company, and I've been in the process of wrapping up my second book, and so my training's been intermittent, and I really want a good training day to be able to assess these things with.
Yeah, do one of them before the big next training day.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Could you talk a little bit about your viewpoint with respect to the trade-offs? We always talk about these trade-offs, and we've done it on a bunch of these podcasts. The trade-offs between high-level athletic performance and health and aging, they're not really aligned at the top levels.
No, they're definitely not. And it's a complex story because for a lot of people, the only reason why they want to live is that high level, competitive activity. Many people can make lots and lots of money doing their activities. So you can make kind of a cost benefit, kind of analysis there that's favorable for giving up maybe a little health and longevity because of a fantastic payday. But it's kind of surprising. It appears wired up for a significant amount of activity, but it's really far afield from what goes into the volume and the intensity of training to be elite in any type of sportive activity. So I've always tended more towards trying to get it, the minimum effective dose. And that will get you quite a ways down the road. It doesn't take a lot of strength training to be reasonably strong. You're not anywhere near a power lifter, but you can be, quite strong for general physical activity. It really doesn't take much cardio training to have a decent cardio base to be able to hike and bike and run and swim, and stay active. But if you want to crack into any degree of specialization and start being competitive at something, then the volume and the intensity starts going up rather dramatically. And for me, the joy just plummets. Part of that is because I'm neurotic. And as soon as I assign a really competitive element to an activity, then that's the last day that I probably enjoyed it my whole life, which is why I haven't actually done much in the way of competing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I just go to the classes. But, it's an interesting thing. And I think that the general population really holds elite level athletes up on a bit of a pedestal, and they assume that the volume and intensity of training that those folks are doing is something that should be emulated, and I just haven't found that to be the case, and I see a lot of people really break themselves as a consequence of that. I finally, in our gym, I ceased training or working with any endurance athletes because they were so neurotic about the desire to maintain that training volume. And when I asked them, would you be willing to go faster, go longer, but it would require less training time and more kind of like sprint work and getting stronger in mechanics. And if I saw this fear on their face, because what I was suggesting was that there would be now 20 hours of their week that they had to interface with their spouse or kids or just life in general. Like what I discovered is a lot of these people were just escaping from something, and they wanted that escape, and the competition was kind of a thing, but they were actually running from some other something. And that was a degree of neuroses that I just didn't really enjoy working with. And so I really enjoyed working with cops and firefighters and folks in the military because due to the demands of their job, they really were motivated to do what I asked them to do so that they could do it better, get bigger, stronger, faster within the confines of what their work was. And that was pretty gratifying to me, and the folks seemed much less neurotic and a little easier to steer towards a good outcome.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that up. Back in the day, I used to train for triathlons. And it was, if you weren't training more than, at the minimum, 20 hours a week, then you were a slacker,
Right.
And so you would always get like the 2-a-days, and you would do insane. It's just insane. You were just constantly beat up, feeling terrible, feeling run down. It was the absolute
And it
worst.
was a badge of honor too.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The marathon running in particular has for many years been sort of a sacred cow and a symbol of personal virtue. And in some ways it is a symbol of a certain degree of depth of character or virtue, willingness to do that. But, we hear more and more of negative health consequences associated with long-term extreme endurance sports, particularly cardiac issues, but others too. And I was wondering if you had any views on this.
Yeah, you just digging in the literature a little bit, you really see very quickly an inflection point where cardio training starts heading into much higher rates of like AFib and some other cardiac issues. But this is tough because on the one hand, we're trying to tell people to get off the couch. We seem to have one of two populations. One group of people, you have to douse them in gasoline to get them off the couch. The other group of people, you need a low jack on them to prevent them from running away, doing too much activity. But yeah, there definitely seems to be a very rapid point of diminishing returns on the health side with regards to the chronic cardio story. I do think that there's a good argument for maintaining a good base level of aerobic conditioning, but Phil Maffetone has done some really great work in that. But I mean, this is very easy-paced stuff.
Yeah.
You're breathing through your nose. It's all fat metabolism driven. It appears to be quite beneficial for kind of calming the sympathetic nervous system. And for most people, it would be therapeutic. For athletes, it wouldn't necessarily be a sufficient intensity to get a performance boost. But I think that that's oftentimes where we see an inflection point, or maybe that's the get off the bus point. When you need to give up that MAF type training, the ability to breathe through your nose for the bulk of your activity. When we really need to start ramping up the volume and the intensity to be competitive at triathlon or at marathon or whatnot. God love you if you want to do it, but just understand that there may be some consequences to it, and just go into it fully educated on that.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience. So, Robb, a few years ago, you jumped into the exciting debate after a study suggested that there is a connection between fish oil and prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Supplementing with omega-3 fatty acids has continued to prompt a debate. What's your stance on this now?
Oh, man, it's really complex. And I used to be in a camp of recommending pretty high dose, omega-3 intake. My somewhat schmarmy default mode now is to just say get as much of it from diet as you can, and then let the rest work out. I mean, there are everything in biology seems to have some sort of a trade-off, So these omega-3, particularly the omega-3 omega-6 balance, drives so much of the inflammatory process, and it can be in a positive or a negative fashion, but really high omega-3 intake, particularly of EPA and DHA, can quiet the immune response in a pretty powerful fashion, which can be good under certain circumstances. But there was actually a study where they gave folks very, very high omega-3 supplementation and as part of organ transplant, because it so quieted the immune response that they were able to use fewer immunosuppressant drugs. Really interesting application, but also could be kind of a scary implication too. If you're that immunosuppressed, what other things could what other problems could you be creating? So again, I've largely defaulted to trying to focus on, getting the bulk of the omega-3s from whole foods, from deep water fish, smaller on the food chain, more like mackerel and sardines and whatnot for bioaccumulation issues as well as sustainability issues. And, I've taken a much more measured approach to the supplementation side, I guess. There's an argument that these highly reactive polyunsaturated fats, if we dump that into an inflamed, already, kind of rich in reactive oxygen species individual, that could be a disaster. It may not really help that person much. We should address some other issues like glycemic load and sleep and gut permeability to reduce that systemic inflammation, reduce the reactive oxygen species load before we really start tackling the omega-3s as an adjunctive therapy or trying to ramp those up so that we get a therapeutic effect.
Absolutely. And, blood testing those levels and looking at the ratios is probably worthwhile.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That EPA or the arachidonic acid EPA ratio is a fantastic one to look at.
I think so too. I don't see any downside in looking at that.
Right.
You're a really successful author, and your book just sold bedoodles, probably nearly 1 million copies or something.
It's right around there, yeah.
That's a lot of books.
It's a good number of books.
And, you're talking to an academic, when we're thrilled if we sell 1,000 books.
Right.
And,
or if 50 people read our paper. So.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, like Yahoo, 50 people read my paper.
Right.
So anyway, I didn't mean to go off in that riff, but writing books, any kind of book, can be an incredible slog. And at points, it really requires a lot of determination and focus. And you kind of have to put your blinders on at some point. Mm-hmm. This thing is not going to write itself, right? Like, just get out of my office.
Right.
It will be quiet. I will do this, right? You've written about how nicotine gum played a substantial role in affording you a kind of productivity boost, I'd say, when writing your latest book, which we're all looking forward to. And, there's a big literature on this. Ever since the 1980s, there's a substantial and consistent literature that shows enhanced focus enhanced resistance to distractions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty clear.
Right.
It's not one of these up and down literatures. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about your experience with nicotine.
Sure. Yeah. So I started researching that when I was asked to present to the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Committee. So these are our pre- and post-deployment events to help build resiliency within the SEAL community. So I spoke to the SEALs, the special boat teams, and then also the families of these folks. And it was on topics of sleep, nutrition, caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. And so I got in and, started putting my materials together. And I had assumed that when I really dug into the pharmacology and the toxicology of nicotine, I just kind of wanted to review that. I assumed that I was going to see all kinds of carcinogenic effects, and I was, going to need to figure out how to couch this for these guys. There are very few smokers within the SEAL teams, but a lot of kind of chew and snuff and stuff like that. But as I started digging into it, I was like, man, this stuff looks pretty good. I was like, enhances dopamine status, lots of studies indicating that it could be beneficial for a number of gastrointestinal issues like Crohn's disease and maybe ulcerative colitis. And the more that I dug around on it, I was just thinking, man, the only problem with nicotine is the delivery system. Like tobacco kind of stinks, but as a pharmacological item, the nicotine seems kind of cool. And both my parents were smokers, and I hated smoking and smokers my whole life. Like it was just the most disgusting thing that I could imagine. Like it could literally almost incite me into physical violence on people if they smoked around me. So I had this really wacky set of emotional baggage on the topic. But then as a biochemist and, kind of a dabbling toxicologist, I was looking at this. I'm like, man, it's really interesting. And so I went and bought some nicotine gum and tried I had a 2 milligram piece and tried half of that, a 1 milligram dose. And it was just a whole other layer of like peeling back the fog and the focus and everything. I mean, it was plugging into the matrix for about 45 minutes to an hour where, my writing was on point. When I edited it later, I was like, wow, that was really good. Like I actually strung together some cogent thoughts, And so I shared this information with the SEAL community. And the first time that I did this, the flight docs that were there just wanted to barbecue me alive. And I had brought a huge stack of toxicology and case reports and kind of studies on this. And I was like, I'm not recommending that they smoke. I'm not recommending that they chew. I'm recommending things like lozenges and gum. And that stuff is not carcinogenic. Show me one study that indicates that it is. And it's kind of like thump, drop that on the table. And so these docs actually, to their credit, read it, but more to the point, these SEALs and special operators started tinkering with this. And I devised a little bit of a stimulant roundtable that they could use. Like if the guys knew that they were going to be moving over ground a significant chunk of distance, we would do about 60 milligrams of caffeine every 2 hours. And that was kind of the optimum therapeutic dose, that they wouldn't get down regulation of the receptor sites for the caffeine. But if they needed some fine motor skill, or they needed the ability to go to sleep soon, but they still needed to be alert for a while, then they would use the nicotine as an alternative. And so we had this kind of pretty nuanced way to use this stuff. And all of these NSW gigs, at the end of a retreat, the participants kind of review the folks who present to them, and that determines who comes back. And for about 7 years, I kept getting invited back. And I'm assuming that it wasn't because I was good looking or particularly entertaining. It was because the material was valuable. And some of the greatest feedback that I had from folks was both the dietary interventions, which really helped normalize blood sugar levels, but also this kind of nuanced way of using stimulants, including nicotine, as a kind of an ergogenic aid for their job.
That's really interesting. Yeah. It kind of gives you this sense, and you're talking about writing with the nicotine and giving you that focus. That one recalls images of writers in smoke-filled rooms, or
Absolutely.
the old newsrooms, the old historic pictures. Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Or old pictures of Hemingway or
Right.
something.
Yeah.
Right.
Or even, you know what, my father was actually a smoker, and that was one of the things, like you said, I always just infuriated. I used to hide his cigarettes, break them, throw them down the toilet, and do everything I could. But he had this insistence that he had to smoke when he was working on models. He did fine scale modeling. So it's really interesting that you're saying that now. It makes kind of sense why
Yeah, it
he
was
did that.
the nicotine.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And nicotine is just a fascinating substance. Just looking at it as a material, it's really, really interesting and extremely addictive. Perhaps the most addictive drug in common use. So, on one of the addiction scales, nicotine is considered a 90% addiction liability. So if 100 people consume it in sufficient quantity, 90% are addicted. To compare that, opiates, which are considered the boogeyman,
Right.
are 50%, or alcohol, of which we have a substantial societal problem, are about 10%. But I want to say something about that, because when you tell me you're addicted to opiates, I can tell you a great long list
Of problems.
of why you'll be very, very sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Not just what it means for you, but what it means for society.
Yep.
And if you're addicted to alcohol, there's a great long list for both society and for you. With nicotine, there's not much of a list.
Right.
I can't think of anything, actually.
But particularly if you shift the delivery system away from tobacco.
Yes, I mean nicotine itself, the
Right.
drug nicotine. I can't think of a societal downside other than, excessively productive writers or something. I mean, some books just shouldn't be written. And the list of health hazards for the individual that I'm aware of, at least, is incredibly short. I'll mention mild peripheral blood vessel restriction. That's of a concern to some people, particularly people with Raynaud's disease. You don't want to restrict the capillaries any further. And for some people who are heavy users for many, many years, there's a literature pointing to cardiomyopathy. But if you look at that list and compare it to caffeine, it's not a very scary list. And it's really the one I'm most interested in is the endothelial nitric oxide suppression. And this causes the vascular issue. But again, it's a minor issue unless you have Raynaud's or some other existing challenge.
Yeah, I got myself into a little bit of deep water in that regard. I was doing some longbow hunting in very cold weather and chewed a piece of nicotine gum.
I know where this is
because
going.
of the vascular constrictive effects,
Yeah.
I went from being completely comfortable to my hands and feet turning into blocks of ice. And it took me about an hour to really undo that. And so there are definitely situations like, if you're prone towards Raynaud's at all, and for folks that aren't familiar, this is if you go from, say, a warm room to a cold room, your hands or feet will turn white because of a really potent vasoconstrictive effect. It's very, very uncomfortable. So if you lean that way at all, the nicotine would probably be not a good idea. And then if you're just in a situation in which you need to keep your extremities warm, possibly not a fantastic idea to use it then.
Absolutely. You hear all kinds of stories about hunters and other folks in extremely cold environments, and they get a little tired and think, wow, I'll have some nicotine.
That's when you want to go for the caffeine right
That's
there.
right.
Yeah.
Have a hot coffee.
Right.
Okay, so let's shift gears. Tell us about Lazy Lobo Ranch.
Oh, man. The Lazy Lobo Ranch. This is my little stab at living the life that I talk about with regards to kind of a holistically managed regenerative agriculture scene. So I was exposed to the work of Alan Savory about 7 years ago, and he has developed a process that appears to reverse desertification, the encroachment of desert into otherwise arable land areas, by using smartly controlled, smartly managed grazing animals. And the idea there is that you start creating a nutrient cycle and a reversion to perennial grasses that can sequester carbon, that reduces the heat footprint, that produces food. It's really a really fascinating story. He's an amazing man, and if you're into systems biology or systems thinking at all, like it's just a deep pool that you can dive into. And I've been talking about this for quite some time, and kind of felt like I should maybe do some of it. And so we ended up getting a little 3-acre ranch there in Reno. And Reno, all of central Nevada used to be a giant grassland. At first it was an inland sea, and then it became a grassland. There's still actually some photographs of Las Vegas before it was overgrazed, where it was chest-high grass as far as you could see. All the sage is a consequence of overgrazing. And people get confused about, like, okay, what's overgrazing versus this holistic management story? And where something can become overgrazed is if you get a group of animals, cows, sheep, goats, could be anything like that, and you remove the predator pressure from these animals so that they can just kind of move around at their leisure and eat whatever they want, these animals will tend to eat kind of the choicest items and then move on. And then just as those choice items are regaining their growth, they're growing back again, then they get eaten again. And this basically stunts the ability for the grass to grow, and you can damage the soil, and the soil gets laid barren, and it oxidizes then, and the whole nutrient cycle kind of stops because we have bacteria and fungi that live below the ground surface that networks with the roots, and they mine minerals out of the soil, and that gets carried to the plants. I mean, it's really a fascinating process, but animals are an integral part of this process. It's the coevolution of plants and animals on the planet. And so I'm working on my own 3-acre plot to do a little bit of a study looking at like soil depth and also just produce food for my family, but using this mob grazing technique where we get animals in a pretty tight bunch using electric fencing, and we let them loose into a new area. And because the animals are bunched up pretty tight, they compete with each other, so they eat everything. And this is the way that they would normally move if there's actual predator kind of pressure on a herd of animals. And we leave them on that section for a day or two, and then we open up a new section and move them along, and then we don't move them back to the original section until a specific period of time has gone by. But we've already done this just for 1 year, and the before and after photos of this piece of desert land are just stunning because a year and a half ago, it was very hard to see any perennial grass in this area. Like, it was mainly sage and this stuff called white top, which is a taproot plant, which is a sign of deeply compacted earth. It's earth that doesn't have much life in it. These taproot plants are trying to get in and be the first stage of secession back into this area. So it's actually a sign of very poor soil health. But we shifted from mainly these taproot plants, very little perennial grass, to now it's like waist-high perennial grasses with very few of these taproot plants. And we've only really done it about a year.
Just in a year.
And I'm an idiot with this stuff. Like, I really don't know quite what I'm doing yet. You know, I've made a ton of mistakes, but it's a really fascinating process. And the water retention that we have on this patch of dirt now is amazing. And, there's lots of discussions about, atmospheric carbon dioxide issues and feeding the world and all kinds of different things. And one of the primary places that folks look is limiting animal production and consumption, mainly because of confined area feedlot type scenarios where the animals are put in a small area and they're fed grains, and it's pretty energetically intensive. And there's very little attention that's been given to this holistic management kind of story. Alan Savory makes the point that 1/3 of all the land masses on the planet are grasslands, and they're really amenable to nothing other than growing large herbivores. Like, they're not particularly great for farming, but they're fantastic at growing grass and growing animals. And And we've really shied away from utilizing those areas in this way. And there's a lot of political and pop culture pressure to shift towards things like meat grown in a lab and some stuff like that. And the ignorance around the thermodynamic inputs and outputs of this story are just baffling. It's more crazy than people thinking that like biodiesel and bioethanol are good ideas. Like nobody drives their tractors on biodiesel and bioethanol because it takes more energy to produce it than what you get out of it. And our food system is kind of a similar story. We need to get more energy out of it than what we put into it. And I think that there's a real opportunity to produce lots of food, address some soil carbon issues, and heat sinks and water utilization. Like when you reestablish these grasslands, the water doesn't just run off. You don't get flooding. It actually refills aquifers and whatnot. And when you drive around the desert areas of Nevada, Arizona, Utah, again, they were historically perennial grasslands, and they've just been misused and kind of damaged to a point where it's going to be quite challenging to rehabilitate them. But this is the work that the Savory Institute is doing, and this is my small piece of digging into that, because I really do believe in the methodology and wanted to kind of experiment on my own, both for my family's resilience, but also as a bit of an example that anybody can get in and do this.
No, it's fascinating. And Alan Savory is a person that more people should know about and pay attention to.
Yeah, he's a brilliant man and has just done amazing work.
You've had a positive impact on a large cohort of people. And between your podcast, your in-person seminars, and your book, The Paleo Solution, which became a New York Times bestseller. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You must feel pretty good about that.
I felt very hoity-toity until Snooki ended up with a New York Times bestseller, and then I realized it didn't really matter at all. So, yeah.
Life has a way of doing that, too.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, Wired to Eat. What might we expect to read?
Oh, Wired to Eat is looking at this evolutionary biology story again, but really from the perspective of the neuroregulation of appetite. And the thing that wasn't really addressed when I tackled this material with the Paleo Solution, the thing that seems to pop up again and again is this sense of guilt and failure and morality around eating. Like that was really the stuff that seems to hamstring people. And I was really trying to figure out how could we diffuse this sense of failure and guilt and make people understand that it's not your fault. We may need to do something. We may need to change gears and do something different. But, the situation is not your fault. Your genetics were forged in a time and in a place that you ideally ate anything that wasn't nailed down, and then you sat down and relaxed. And so it was a story of eat more, move less. And our current medical suggestion is that we should eat less, move more, which just flies in exactly the opposite scenario of what our genetics are basically wired for. And it ignores these topics like hyperpalatable foods and the neuroregulation of appetite, the ability to bypass the neuroregulation of appetite. So on the front end of the book, my goal is to diffuse all of the morality and the sense of failure around eating. The condition of sickle cell anemia grew out of a situation in which people were exposed to a new vector of disease, malaria, via these Anopheles mosquitoes. And it created a selection pressure that was so powerful that it's one of the most rapidly emerging genetic changes in human history. People with sickle cell anemia have a survival advantage against malaria, but it comes at a very high risk. But it was a net win for us. But the same features that forged that adaptation are the same features that forged our adaptation to seek out novel foods and hyperpalatable foods. And we would never consider moralizing or looking down on somebody with sickle cell anemia because they're a survivor. And so we can't moralize or look down on people who find overeating to be challenging. Like it's the same evolutionary pressures that forge both of these situations. So my hope is that both on a cognitive level and on a more kind of gestalty emotional level that people can plug into this and understand, okay, I'm not a failure. I'm not a screw up because this stuff is hard. And then if they're able to get a little bit of emotional distance from this process, then we can use the back part of the book where we use a 30-day reset to try to get the neuroregulation of appetite back within some sort of a normal boundary, get them insulin sensitive again, and then we use a 7-day carb test plan to really try to get in and find what amounts and types of carbohydrates these people do best with or potentially worse with so that they know what to avoid. And then I have one final chapter in the end of the book called Hammers, Drills, and Ketosis, the only tool your doctor will never use. And I talk about ketosis and fasting from the perspective of kind of a carpenter, that a carpenter wouldn't argue about would I use a drill, a saw, or a hand axe in certain situations. These things aren't interchangeable, and there wouldn't be a lot of drama about the use of one of these tools appropriately. But ironically, within medicine, the idea of ketosis and fasting as a tool is just this incredibly controversial topic. And so I talk about what ketosis and fasting are and are not, kind of lay out the argument for how it might be appropriate for certain folks under given circumstances. So we start with kind of a defusing of the emotionality, provide some really easy solutions via a neuroregulation of appetite reset, some mapping of carbohydrate foods to figure out which ones you work best with. And then if we really need to kind of pull in the big guns, then I go pretty deep on ketosis and fasting if folks need that additional information.
Sounds like it's going to be a really, really good book. So I understand the estimate right now is it's going to be out in March of 2017?
March or April of 2017,
Okay, awesome. Yeah. And Amazon is actually taking pre-orders.
They are, oddly enough. Yeah, I'm the almost finished edited manuscript is sitting in my computer right now, and I just need to press send and send it to the publisher, and hopefully I'm done with that.
Well,
so
that's exciting, really exciting. So tell us a little bit about the genesis of your own podcast, The Paleo Solution.
So it came out right around the time that I released the first book, but what was happening is I was receiving so many questions on the blog that I couldn't really stay on top of it. So initially, my blogging started off writing articles on different topics, and I would get tons of questions. Many of the questions were better than the material I had originally written, or, it drove me in different directions. So many of the subsequent podcasts were just a process of answering these questions and providing some context. And then eventually the volume of emails became such that I couldn't address all of them. So we started triaging them and kind of breaking them into groups, and then I would address them via the podcast, at least initially. And that worked pretty well for a while, but as people became better educated on this kind of paleo evolutionary biology topic, what happened is that most people were able to figure out most of the common issues that they had. And so the questions I received became more and more complex, more and more kind of medically oriented. And it felt like a cop-out to say, well, you need to go talk to your doctor. And then the response was, well, I don't know any doctors that deal in this stuff. Yeah. And then it just became a process of trying to track somebody down to help the person. So I shifted the podcast focus then to more of an interview format with only occasional kind of Q&A activity, because as the information got out there, just people were able to deal with the most common issues, and then the uncommon issues, they really needed to work with a healthcare provider. So it's gone through multiple iterations, and currently it's much more in a interview format, but I'm actually thinking about splitting the time between the interview format and kind of doing a news roundup. I really enjoy the interview format, but it's kind of stressful because I need to be on the whole time because it's just me and that person, and I need to really be on point about the questions that I'm asking and whatnot, and I'd like to be able to relax a little bit more and just kind of free associate. And so I'm thinking about splitting time a little bit and doing a little bit of a news roundup and a research roundup to address what's kind of hot in the health scene in the last week or so.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Oh, thanks.
Well,
thanks.
We're all fans here.
Thank you.
Of your podcast. So, Robb, it's been awesome having you on the podcast. Ken and I have really enjoyed speaking with you today. So,
huge honor to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it was really fun.
You guys are doing fantastic work on this. The pre-production, post-production, it's really impressive. You guys are doing a fantastic job, and I'm a huge fan of your podcast, too. I listen to it every time it comes out.
Well, thanks, Rob, and especially thank you for your lecture last night here at IHMC.
Apparently, I knocked them dead last night.
Yeah,
so.
you slayed a few people.
Yeah, you absolutely did. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
The Slayer.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Wow, that was a fun interview with Rob. I particularly thought his bit about nicotine gum or patches for cognitive enhancement was pretty interesting. Who knew? So, Ken, it was also interesting that you identified some potential downsides to nicotine supplementation, such as mild peripheral blood vessel restriction.
Folks with Raynaud's disease should probably avoid it altogether.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. So if you enjoyed this interview as much as we did, I invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes, stemtalk.us.
I also invite you to check out the video arising from Rob's recent lecture at IHMC. A link for the video can be found in the show notes.
This is Dawn Kernagis signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.